Okay, so let's start. Very warm welcome from my side. I'm David Kleffling. I'm a PhD student at the Kiel Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to the session on the costs of trade war. And I directly hand over to Lydia Cox, who will present on the long-term impact of steel tariffs on US manufacturing.
Okay, well, thanks all for coming. So Paul gave me a nice kind of introduction into what I'm going to be talking about today. But really, the motivation for this paper is this idea that kind of globally integrated supply chains really complicate the traditional cost-benefit analysis of tariffs. You know, we know that when tariffs are placed on certain goods, they may help some industries. But especially when they're placed on very upstream inputs, protection can also come at a cost. And tariffs on these upstream products are going to raise input costs for downstream manufacturers. This isn't a secret. I think, policymakers know this to some extent. Economists certainly know it. But a lot of times what happens, I guess, sort of in more of the traditional state of the world that we've been used to with tariff policy sort of before the current period, is that tariffs and other types of emergency safeguards on products like steel are put in place, and they're justified as being temporary in nature. So the idea is, okay, we're going to put in place tariffs for a couple years. Yes, there may be some negative side effects, but it's going to help the steel industry, and then we'll take them out. And so there are even kind of requirements in the laws that allow the executive to put tariffs in place on things like steel that actually enforce that they're only supposed to be in place for short periods of time. So they're justified as temporary measures. What we really don't know very much about is the long-term behavior of these kind of spillover effects into downstream industries. And so that's what this paper is trying to uncover a little bit more in the data. So really, at its heart, this is a paper about measurement. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that and how do we actually get a good enough measure of steel use by downstream industries to allow me to kind of do the case study that I'm going to do, which is to study the steel tariffs that were put in place by George Bush in the US in 2002 and 2003. I won't get into the details now because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about kind of what I do in the rest of the talk. With this new data that I put together, I'm going to provide some new empirical evidence that you saw a little flash of in Paul's talk, which is that even short-term kind of temporary tariffs on upstream products can have very persistent effects on downstream industries. I'm going to show that downstream industries that faced higher tariffs on their steel inputs suffered kind of persistent declines in exports, and they just lose global market share in kind of their products. I see similar declines in output and employment. And really kind of, this is an empirical paper, but the mechanism you should have in mind is, again, kind of similar to some of the stuff that Paul was talking about, models that feature these kind of relationship-specific sunk costs, which say if I want to kind of find a new supplier, I have to make some investment in order to find that supplier, are going to be consistent with the evidence that I'm finding. Okay, I'm going to skip the literature in the interest of time and jump into just the policy setting that I'm studying. So the tariffs that were put in place by the Bush administration, they went into effect on March 20th of 2002. They were supposed to be in place for 3 years, and in each year they were supposed to be kind of stepped down by a little bit. They ended up being eliminated early in December of 2003 after a lot of backlash from U.S. trading partners and threats of retaliation, though at that time no retaliation actually occurred. And eventually the WTO decided that the tariffs were illegal, and the U.S. ended up withdrawing them early. These tariffs went into place on 171 steel products. So these are HS 8-digit steel products across 13 categories of steel. So categories of steel are going to be like hot rolled steel, cold rolled steel, that type of thing. The tariffs that were put in place range from 8 to 30%, and these tariffs were going to be on top of existing rates. What I'm plotting here is just the legislated tariff rate on these steel products. So you can see that existing rates were virtually zero before the tariffs went in. They go up by a sizable amount for this short period of time, about 2 years, and then they come back out. So this is going to be kind of the shock that I'm studying. All right, so I think kind of the typical approach to estimate the effects of tariffs through supply chains takes kind of the following general form. And this is, not something that has been done a ton in the empirical literature, but certainly with the more recent rounds of Trump tariffs, there were a couple studies kind of taking this approach. So you're going to have some outcome variable for an industry that you care about. You throw that on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you need some kind of measure of exposure, right? How exposed is that downstream industry to the input tariff that you're looking at? Now, the common approach is going to be to measure exposure using input-output tables that we can get from a lot of publicly available sources. In the U.S., we typically use the input-output tables that are published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And they're going to provide measures of steel use in each industries, which you can kind of calculate as a share of total intermediate input costs. All right, so the typical idea would be if I use more steel, I'm going to be exposed more to these steel tariffs, and I can use that as sort of my variation. Now, the problem is that input-output tables tend to be very aggregated. The BEA table in the U.S. has a category for steel that's called iron and steel mills and ferroalloy manufacturing. This is just kind of a catch-all for a lot of different steel types. Whereas tariffs are applied at a very specific level. So the tariff line level is the HS 8-digit product. And I have here just a description of, an HS 8 steel product. And you can see, by the length of the description, this is describing a very particular type of steel. So the BEA actually provides kind of a concordance between their categories and HS codes. And their steel category is a compilation of roughly 300 HS 8-digit products. All right? So we can think about sort of when using this aggregate exposure measure would be okay. And it's okay if tariffs are applied uniformly to the entire BEA category, right? If all 300 of those HS 8-digit products get hit with the same tariff, then you're fine. This wasn't the case for the Bush steel tariff, so only about half of those products were actually targeted. Or if this is not true, this would be okay if all downstream industries used kind of all types of steel in the same proportion, in which case, even if there was some variation in the tariffs, well, everybody should have gotten hit with sort of the same tariff rate. And this one, I think we can all sort of agree, it's just not a good assumption. So think about, soup cans, which use steel. They're going to use very different types of steel than cars, which are going to use kind of lots of types of steel, and certainly different ones. All right, so this is sort of the problem. So next I'm going to talk about sort of what I do to get around this. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact for this paper that during the more recent Trump steel tariffs that were imposed in 2017 and 2018, there was a process by which firms could file requests to have certain products be excluded from the tariffs. And in particular, firms were able to file, they had to file this form, OMB form 0640139, for each 10-digit, HS 10-digit steel product that they wanted to request be excluded from the tariffs. On the forms, you can't really see the details, but what I have boxed in red in different colors are kind of some of the information that I have on these forms. This form was for a company, was submitted by a company called Indiana Automotive Fasteners. So I have some information about the firm that's submitting the product. I know the 10-digit product that they're talking about, that the request is for, so that's up in the right-hand corner. There's some information about the quantity of the product that that firm uses. So they tell me kind of how much are they actually requesting an exclusion for, and also what is the average amount of that product that they use in their production over the last 2 years. And then there's a bunch of kind of text at the bottom, which are comments. And in the comments, the firm kind of describes how they use that steel product and why they think the exclusion is justified. So what I'm going to do is take advantage of the fact that this is sort of like a revealed input-output table in a way. These firms are sort of telling me exactly how they use these different steel products. And this is going to allow me to kind of get at the more detailed relationships that I need. I'm going to kind of go through this quick just for time, but you know, I do some work to try to show that I have sort of good coverage. So the Trump steel tariffs were much broader than the Bush steel tariffs, which allows me to feel pretty confident that I have a pretty good picture of steel use as a whole using these exclusion requests. You know, I could cover kind of about 90% of steel imports, and if I make some other assumptions, I can kind of get 100% of steel imports. There's some, you know, sensitivity analysis and kind of robustness that I do to kind of make sure that you know, I'm pretty well covered. But what these requests are going to allow me to do is identify which types of steel are used by which downstream industries. So first, I'm going to be able to identify the set of steel inputs that are used by each downstream industry. Just do I have an exclusion request for that product that I map to industry D? I should have mentioned like the most important part. I took a bunch of slides out for this short talk, but I'm going to actually use these comments that are on the forms. And I read them and I manually map them to a downstream HS code. All right, so that was sort of the manual labor in the paper. Okay, once I know this set of steel inputs that are used by each downstream industry, I'm going to calculate the weight for each of those steel inputs using the other information that I have on the requests about the quantities of those steel products that are used by the downstream industries. All right, and I'm going to convert those quantities to dollars using just import unit values. All right, so this is going to tell me for each industry which steel products do they use and kind of in what proportions. All right. So basically, again, to bring this to life a little bit more, I'm able to kind of look at each downstream industry and break up total steel use into the shares that are spent on different types. So, you know, from my table, I can see, well, metal cans, they use mostly tin mill products and some coated steel. Appliances are going to use a lot of stainless steel. And, you know, architectural structures use this hot rolled steel, which is the type of things that makes like I-beams and kind of structural components. And you can see right here that basically because these different steel products were taxed differently under the Bush tariffs, these weights are going to be really important for understanding exposure. So, you know, tin mill products got hit with a 30% tariff, but stainless steel didn't get hit at all. And so even though these two industries have, you know, similar steel cost shares, those exposure measures would be wrong if we just took those at face value. Okay. I'm going to skip this and just show you, once I have those weights, kind of the hard work is done, I'm going to calculate a weighted average for each downstream industry of the tariff that it got hit with on its steel products. And then, of course, having a high tariff doesn't matter that much if you don't use a lot of steel as a percent of your total costs. So I'm going to multiply the change in tariffs that each downstream industry faced by the kind of aggregate BEA cost share measure. So this is going to tell me kind of what was the change in my total input costs as a downstream industry that I faced because of the Bush tariffs. And this is going to be kind of my key right-hand side variable. All right. So hopefully, you know, you have sort of a sense of how I construct the data. This is the meat of the paper, is just kind of constructing the data. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of show you quickly the results. So I'm going to use a local projection approach to estimate the effects of these tariffs. So on the right-hand side, again, I have that change in costs that I constructed for each downstream industry, and that's going to be that theta, the coefficient on that cost variable is the one that I'm going to be focused on. I'm also going to control separately for the industry steel cost share. So here I'm trying to emphasize that the variation that I have that I think is exogenous is coming from the tariff and the fact that different downstream industries use different mixes of steel products and those products were tariffed differently. The fact that there's different steel intensities across industries isn't where, you know, my identification assumptions kind of don't cover that part of it. So I'm going to control for that separately. Fixed effects. One other thing, you know, these tariffs were put in place kind of very close to the China shock, and so I'm going to control for the change in Chinese export shares in these downstream industries as well, just to make sure that that's not kind of driving things. Okay, so I'm going to show you kind of a bunch of pictures that look similar to this, and look sort of similar to the ones that Paul showed earlier, but these are the results for U.S. nominal exports and export quantities. So you can see that industries for which the steel tariffs increased input costs by relatively more suffer relative declines in exports. These declines are driven by, you know, quantity declines. And importantly, these declines are just very persistent. So the tariffs are only in place for 2 years, but I'm picking up kind of significant effects, you know, well past they were taken out. The U.S. kind of, you know, not only do they just sort of suffer these export losses, but you can actually see that they're losing market share to their competitors. So here I'm plotting the response of the U.S. share of world exports in these downstream industries, and you can see the same pattern. One of the neat things is you can say, okay, who would be the most likely countries that the U.S. is losing export share to? Well, it should probably be the other countries that were sort of the top exporters of these downstream products. So if you go in the data and you look at, you know, the top 3 countries that were exporting those downstream products in 2001, and you look at the effect of the tariffs in industries on those countries' market shares, you can see sort of the flip. So, you know, the U.S. is losing market share, and we can see it sort of translating into its top competitors. Okay, and then you can sort of do a similar thing for output and employment using different data, but you see a similar picture. So the last thing I want to sort of leave you with is just the intuition behind this kind of persistence that I'm finding. You know, again, I think relatively standard models with relationship-specific sunk costs can rationalize this. And the idea is basically, you know, the steel tariffs, they raise costs for U.S. producers. Those producers raise their prices. If I was buying from the U.S. And I see the higher prices, if the prices are high enough, I might find it worth it to pay some kind of cost to switch and find a new supplier. When the prices go back down, if the tariffs are removed, it may not be worth it for me to pay that cost again to switch back to the U.S. And so you can generate persistence in a model just, you know, in a pretty simple way. there's two kind of somewhat testable implications of this story. One is that changes in exports should be driven by extensive margin changes. These are actually, firms kind of losing customers. And the other one is that, our models would tell us that products that are super differentiated, right? I'm buying something that somebody's producing specifically for my, product that I'm producing, where there was this kind of relationship-specific investment that was made. Those relationships should be stickier. So we should see kind of less movement. So the last... I don't have extensive firm level data, so I'm going to kind of create a rough proxy for the extensive margin using the most detailed trade data we can find, which is 10-digit exports at the customs district level to different countries. So we're going to think about like a golf cart that's exported from Savannah, Georgia to Japan. I'm going to count up the number of these, what I'm going to call trade relationships for each downstream industry. I'm going to use that as my extensive margin proxy. I'm going to then also split industries into kind of specific and non-specific using the kind of traditional Rausch measures. And then I'll just leave you with this last set of graphs. So you can see that these declines really seem to be occurring, at least, my extensive margin proxy is picking up these persistent declines. And then if I split these into kind of the specific goods where we think we shouldn't see that big of an effect, we don't. And the kind of non-specific, more homogeneous goods is kind of where we're seeing it. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Okay, then I hand over to Feodora Teti for the discussion.
I don't really, whatever.
Yeah.
Can I? Yeah. Okay, first of all, thanks for the organizers to letting me discuss this paper. I was actually fighting for it, so I was supposed to discuss a different paper, but then I saw that Lydia was presenting her job market paper, and I asked the organizers whether I can discuss it. It's a great paper. I really like it. It's also one of these papers. So first of all, you should all read it. I think it's going to be also a very influential paper, I think, and it's really great. As for discussion, it's a little bit of a hard paper because there's just not that much to say. So this is one of these papers when you read it and you read a paragraph and you're like, oh, but did you think of that? And then in the next paragraph, she's explaining exactly what you just thought about. And so, but anyways, I'm going to have a couple of comments. So what does this paper do? Lydia's presentation was very clear, but let me just quickly summarize. So this paper asked the question, what are the effects of temporary steel tariffs on downstream industries? She looks at this, it's like like the first round of like steel tariffs in a sense. It's under different presidents, so not Trump, but Bush. And here the Bush steel tariffs covered 171 steel products. And they were in effect for almost 2 years, starting from March 2002. So what does she do in the paper? So essentially, she didn't even talk about this, but there's something that I'm going to call like the first stage. So she first shows you that there is actually an effect on the steel tariff. That the steel tariff has an effect on the protected industry, so that steel reacts. And then she looks at the more interesting, as she says, the meat of the paper is really this linking of the downstream and the downstream industries of steel. And so she asked, what are the effects on exports and many other outcomes of downstream industries in terms of values, quantities, and prices. And then also, what are the effects on production and employment, which I think are actually so especially for policy relevance, this is super important because ultimately the argument for protection, so for tariffs, especially for this kind of tariff, because this is a safeguard tariff, is usually because, it's usually jobs. And so the idea is to really protect the domestic industry, and you want to, and that's the goal, so essentially to save jobs. And her paper essentially shows us that that's not necessarily what's happening. The big contribution is really on the measurement side. So Lydia introduces a novel and very granular measure for input-output linkages. And with this at hand, she measures how much steel using, so the downstream industry, was affected by the steel tariffs. What does she find? Oh, sorry, empirical strategy. So with this variation, so she constructs this measure of exposure for the downstream industries, and then she runs these local projections. And that's the empirical strategy, essentially. So what are the main findings? Well, first, the downstream industries were affected negatively. And then I think what is like really the key result here is that this effect is extremely persistent. So prices remained high until at least 7 years after the Bush tariffs were lifted. And that's something that, is also a bit surprising. I mean, you would kind of expect a temporary measure to also lead to something to lead like all of the outcome variables essentially to bounce back like as soon or relatively fast after the policy has been taken away. And then also something that she's a little bit, so this is definitely more in the paper than in the presentation, but the job losses in downstream industries were actually larger than there are jobs in the entire steel sector. So and this is important, again, because it kind of tells you that the policy goes completely, it has like very unintended effects, and we should really care about this. So let me start by like the first comment. So I think like for me, and I think also Lydia's presentation made this very clear, the main contribution of this paper is really this super cool new way of measuring these very granular input-output, or like constructing these granular input-output tables. Why is that important? Usually, we're happy that there are the BA tables because those are the most disaggregated that we have, and they have I think roughly 400 industries, and I don't know how many of those are actually services. I really don't know, but I think in terms of goods, probably my guess is it's like maybe something like 209, like 300, something like that. If you don't want to work with the BA data, so the BA data is only for the US. So many people use other input-output tables, typically Feodora or like other stuff. Feodora is even, Feodora it's much more aggregated. Why is it a problem? Well, because especially, think of the global value chain like crisis almost like after COVID. This was about a couple of products. It was not about an entire manufacturing sector or like a car sector. It was really about one particular product. And so I think it's very cool to have this new kind of method here, how we can construct this much more disaggregated measure for input-output tables. And it's incredibly like how much work they went in. I think you didn't really, so you should read the paper to really fully acknowledge this. So she went in and like, so there's like also a lot of manual work here that went into this paper. And so I think this is super cool. Let me give you, so I think what the paper could do is like it could stress a bit more this contribution, because I think it's really key. And so it would be nice, for example, to have, like just to have like, so what I would have expected is like something along the lines, like what would happen if you weren't using your disaggregated, super nice, cool input-output tables, what would you find? Probably, my guess is not that much. So just because you cannot even do this kind of analysis at this high levels that Feodora, also the BA tables give you. And then, of course, the other big question is this scalable to other industries, or is this just something for steel? Because if it's scalable, then Lydia has essentially all of the toolbox at hand that she can just, scale it up, and she can provide all of us like with super cool data that everyone is going to use and going to like. So, and I think this would really, like these two things would really push the paper even more, like to make like the contribution in a sense a bit clearer. There are a couple of things that I would like to understand a bit better. So one of them, or like the main thing, was like whether there's like a rationale of the firm when they fill out this form, like to put, for example, only 1 or 2 products because they know that one is going to give them, it's going to make it easier for them to actually get the exclusion restriction. To get the exclusion restriction. I also didn't, like, I don't know anything about this exclusion process, so it would have been nice to have like a little bit more background to that, just to understand better, like whether there are some underlying assumptions in there that I should be thinking about when reading the paper or not. And then there is a little bit of a validation exercise in the paper, but it's more, so when I think of a validation exercise, I would, usually you would go and like say, either like, you know, like you have some interviews with like some industry experts, and they tell you like what that is. So that's like the kind of exercise that I would normally have in mind. Here it's of course hard. So one thing that I thought of, maybe you could go and like check out Timo Fetzer's work, because he has like a different approach, but also tries to like get at these super granular input-output tables. And then also, I was wondering whether you could use AI to verify like the text HS mapping. Yeah, what I also think is super interesting is like this. So the as I said before, like one big contribution of this paper is this persistence in the effect, and I think it's kind of interesting to unpack that a little bit more. In the paper, I think in the presentation it's a bit more clear like than in the paper right now. So a lot of like the comments here are like much clearer in the paper. So let me just skip this. But sorry. So I think what that also speaks to, so why is that important? Because I think overall we kind of want to know like what can we take from your paper and like transfer it to today. I mean, now we are again in a world where there are like a ton of tariffs. We kind of want to know like, is this special to steel? Or not, and if so, like what kind of things can we transfer, what can we not transfer? And I think that would be super interesting, like a like half page at the end of the paper, just to get like a better sense. Yeah, and then let me just conclude essentially with like some other like it's not really big comments. One is like more about like I was a little bit thinking about potentially omitted variable bias. So here especially. I mean, there could have been other trade policy changes in that period that might have affected the results here, other anti-dumping tariffs or safeguard tariffs and so on. And then what I think is a little bit too short in the paper is this comparison between jobs gains and jobs lost, because ultimately that's like for like the policy relevance of this question, this is really what matters. And so I think you can be a bit more brave. I mean, we know that there are a lot of assumptions, but I think you can definitely stress this a bit more than you do currently in the paper. And then I only have like a couple of minor things. Again, it's a great paper. Everyone should read it. And thanks for letting me discuss it.
Okay. Do you want to directly respond? And then we can collect some questions.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Feodora. That was super helpful, and you kind of hit the nail on the head of where I also think I can sort of do a little bit more work. I think doing this kind of more validation is something that I'm working on right now. It's tough in that there's not so I managed to find, I skipped through this slide really quickly, but at least one like document that the US ITC put together where they actually surveyed a bunch of firms and actually made a table at like a really aggregated level of which steel types different industries use. So for like 4 industries, I can see that they have sort of a measure that helps me a little bit and kind of show that I line up well with that. In terms of the AI stuff, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday with Feodora, but I've spent some time, because it would be amazing to kind of be able to expand this a little bit more. And I did spend like a lot of grad school kind of sitting and, you know, staring at these descriptions and trying to figure out how to map them to HS codes. The big problem that I've had in trying to use the like ChatGPT is that the descriptions are not they're not very systematic, and they're not very clean in many cases. So some firms will write like a whole paragraph with, you know, some sob story about, you know, what's going on with their firm. Some won't even actually say a downstream industry, or, you know, that they're trying to that they use the product for, even though they're instructed to on the form. They'll just say something else. And so I've had a hard time kind of wrangling the LLMs to kind of do a good job, but I think that's something that, you know, should be able to be done. And so hopefully I can expand this. In principle, so these requests were filed for aluminum, so for sure, you know, that's an industry that you could do this for. And then in principle, anything that got hit with the Section 301 tariffs, which were the tariffs on China, those also got hit. So that's a huge set of products where, in principle, you can sort of use this methodology. So that's something that's a pipe dream for the future. So I'll leave a little bit of time for questions, but thank you very much.
Yes.
The persistence result is fascinating, and it would be nice to understand it a little better, right? The tariffs take place in 2002. Mm-hmm. The WTO is still doing very well then. So it was in a way predictable, right, that the ruling would go against the tariffs and that they would be phased out. So why switch? Why break relationships?
Yeah.
And also, if you don't go back to buying from the U.S. Supplier, is it that, maybe U.S. suppliers were not the cheapest to begin with? Do you need some model with rational inattention? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think it's for sure true that in the steel industry, I think people knew that these were going to be temporary. And there's even, like, Doug Irwin told me this great story about how the law says that if the tariffs are in place for more than 3 years, there has to be this like mid-term review of the tariffs. And the administration actually put the tariffs in for 3 years and 1 day, sort of knowing that it would trigger the review, because I think they didn't really think the tariffs were a good idea. They just wanted to make the steel industry happy. At least what in my head makes more sense is that sort of foreign customers in downstream industries may not have had such a good sense of why are we seeing the prices increase for the U.S. cars or whatever. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of whether they actually had the right expectations about the persistence of the policy. I think to the last point, you definitely need for the U.S. to have been at least close in price to the competitor to get in a model the buyer to not switch back, right? But it could be they had the same price, or it was epsilon different. The fixed cost, the tariff is enough to get them to switch, and then the two are close enough that it's just not worth paying it to go back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On the persistence of the shock, with some of co-authors, with Vasco Carvalho, Stephen Hansen, and Giancarlo Corsetti, we ran a similar exercise that you, but the shock is not a supply shock. It is a demand, monetary policy demand. And we wanted to check what is the difference between the downstream and upstream. And we find the same result that you.
Oh, interesting.
That is the downstream shock. It is more immediate and more larger, but temporary. But the upstream shock, it is slower at the beginning, but much more persistent. We didn't enter in the detail on why is this, but this is maybe some validation for your work.
Yeah.
My second question is that will be in line with your discussion. It will be nice to understand what is the difference between the larger and the smaller companies on this shock. If it is one size fits all, or there is difference between the large and the small. Sure.
Yeah, so implicitly, like since I'm kind of using these firm level requests and then zooming back out to the industry level, I'm sort of assuming that, at least collectively, the firms are sort of giving me a good picture of what the industry uses in terms of inputs. I have done a little bit to try to see, like, what does the distribution of firm sizes look like, because I know the firm names, so I was able to merge those with Orbis, and they are, I think the mean is slightly larger than kind of the distribution in the U.S. Kind of overall of manufacturing firms, but it's not only big firms. So you have a pretty big range. And so, yeah, ultimately what I need is that the big firms and the small firms sort of use similar inputs, and that, together they all sort of, file requests for the set of inputs that get used. But, yeah.
Okay, final short question before we move on.
Okay, I couldn't help but think about the Bensati paper on what's go up may not come down, because it seemed like there's a symmetry play some role here. And I dig a bit into those like sticky price theory. So one way you could like try to show with theory is like accord more to the reality is price dispersion, because many of like search theory model will predict that price dispersion will be the same, even the sticky price. And I think you can show dispersion here, and you can like help show us which mechanism work better.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, there have been, you know, ways in macro and some ways in trade to basically figure out how can you get sort of hump-shaped responses, right? Stuff that doesn't just revert right back. And it's all some form of, there's some wedge in adjustment. And I think, I mean, Feodora said this too. It's something that we don't know that much about is exactly what are those wedges. But certainly kind of exploring different ones would be a good thing to do. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks again. Okay, next up we have Jin Liu, who's presenting on sabotage. You prefer this mic or standing there? Yeah.
Right, hello everyone. It's a great honor to present this work to you in the beautiful Paris. And this is about sabotage as industrial policy, co-authored with Martin Rothenberg and Sharon Treberman. So this paper was motivated by our observations of Trump and Biden administration's policies against China, in particular their policies against China's semiconductor industry. They've been taking actions such as the CHIPS Act to undermine China's semiconductor capabilities by restricting Chinese firms' access to essential equipment and staff. And they explicitly described these actions as industrial policy, with the stated goal being to maintain as large of a lead as possible. So their national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said in this quote that they think such actions is a new strategic asset to the United States, and it needs to be implemented in a comprehensive way. So this is what we're going to study in this paper, sabotage policy. But that we mean home countries' policy to directly lower foreign countries' productivity. And this is different from traditional policy tools like tariffs and export taxes. Because when you talk about those tariffs or those policies, you take as fixed the distribution of productivities or comparative advantage. Whereas sabotage is directly trying to target to change the distribution of productivity. Of course, both economic and non-economic interests are considered in such policies. So our goal is not to understand the motivations for why countries might have such policies. We take their existence as given and just trying to understand the economic consequences of them. So there has been a debate about whether such policies have been successful or not. And the first point we want to make is that what matters is not whether home country is able to lower foreign productivity at all. Instead, what matters is whether the destruction of foreign productivity is comprehensive enough. So the first result we want to show is a non-monotonicity in policy, in a sense that when targeted at the same good, if home country conducts a technology transfer that improves foreign country's technology, it's going to benefit home's welfare by making imports cheaper. Symmetrically, if home country conducts a modest sabotage policy to lower foreign country's productivity a little bit, it's going to have the opposite effect. It's going to harm home country's welfare by making imports more expensive. Whereas if a home country increases the intensity of sabotage to make it comprehensive, what's going to happen is that what used to be produced by foreign country is now going to be relocated back to home. So home starts to produce these sabotaged goods. It's going to increase home's income and terms of trade. That increases home country's welfare again. So another way of reading this is that sabotage policy is only beneficial if it is comprehensive. Then our second contribution is to show that the benefits of sabotage can actually be characterized by a few sufficient statistics that we know how to measure in data. All right, so this is a theoretical paper, and the setup is the classic Dornbusch-Fisher-Samuelson 1977 model. we have two countries, home and foreign, and a continuum of goods indexed by I. And then each country has fixed labor supply, firms are competitive, pretty standard stuff. Demand is Cobb-Douglas, with beta I being the expenditure share of good I. Production technology is also standard. Labor is the only production input, and unit labor requirement is A. This is home country's productivity. And we define comparative advantage to be the A schedule, which is home country's productivity relative to foreign country's productivity, product by product. And then we rank goods so that A is a decrease in schedule. Okay, there is trade because consumers are going to source from the cheapest origin, either home or foreign. And for the baseline model that I'm going to show you, we'll assume away trade costs. And it's going to have complete specialization. But before we take the model to quantification exercise in data, we're going to bring back more realistic features of the world by adding back trade costs, allowing for incomplete specialization, etc. So for most of the time, we're going to think about sabotage as the only policy tool. And by that, we mean home country can directly affect foreign TFP by changing a star. However, in later part of the presentation, I'm going to show you what happens if we add back traditional policy tools like tariffs and export taxes. So the free trade equilibrium is going to be characterized by two conditions. The first is optimal sourcing by consumers. That will imply that there is a cutoff product for which comparative advantage schedule is going to be equal to relative wage, which is omega. And then the second equilibrium condition is from assuming balanced trade. And that is going to assume that the relative wage is going to be equal to some relative demand schedule, which is the B schedule. And this is foreign countries' demand for homes imports relative to home countries' demand for foreign exports. So the equilibrium is reached when these two schedules intersect. Graphically, this is going to be how equilibrium is reached at this cutoff point. And then we want to characterize home country's welfare. So home country's welfare has two components. The first component is the area of this rectangular, which is how much terms of trade is multiplied by home country's import share. The second component is a term that changes with price index. So home country has higher welfare if terms of trade is more favorable, or if price index is lower so that imports is cheaper. Then now we're ready to introduce policies to this framework, and we're going to consider local sabotage policy, meaning that home country is going to choose a location of the products to be sabotaged, and it's going to change foreign productivity for an epsilon mass of products around this location. And we consider three cases of such local policies. In the first case, home country conducts a technology transfer that decreases the S schedule for the local products. It's going to make foreign country more productive and make imports cheaper, and that increases home country's welfare, which is the area of the pink color. Symmetrically, if home country conducts some minor sabotage, and the key point is that sabotage is modest enough to not change the pattern of specialization. So the cutoff goods stays the same, where each good is produced stays as the same as before. And then the effect is going to be the opposite to the first case, because foreign country becomes less productive. That lowers global production efficiency, making imported goods more expensive, which lowers home country's welfare. What's more interesting is to consider the third case, where we have comprehensive sabotage. This is the case where the pattern of production is going to be shifted. So for this comprehensive sabotage, we're allowing home country to change foreign country's productivity for this local range of products to almost zero. So that means home country's comparative advantage is going to infinitely high for these local products. And then immediately the implication is that the production of those sabotaged goods are going to be relocated back to home country. So that means we're shifting these sabotaged goods back to home country to produce. And then because home country has limited resource, in order to absorb the production of these sabotaged goods, it needs to give up some marginal product for foreign to produce. And what is the net effect of this kind of relocation on home country's welfare is what we try to characterize later. And there is a benefit and a loss from sabotage. The benefit comes from the fact that home is now producing the sabotaged goods. It has more income, it has higher terms of trade, and there is a gain from that. However, there is efficiency loss coming from the fact that we're distorting global production. We're making global production less efficient, which distorts the price indexes and harm a home country. So that is the loss of this area of the blue color. Then our first result is to show that actually the benefit and the efficiency cost can be characterized by a few sufficient statistics that we know how to estimate them. So the benefit of sabotage is going to be the first term in the bracket, which depends on home country's import share and the trade elasticity. So the intuition is that when import share is high, trade matters a lot for home country, so terms of trade gain is more important. And when trade elasticity is low, that means home country's consumers are insensitive to price changes. So increase in domestic price is less distortionary. The important thing to note is that the benefit of sabotage does not depend on which goods you sabotage. It only depends on the cutoff good and the shape of the comparative advantage and relative demand around the cutoff good. It doesn't depend on the location of the sabotaged goods. Whereas the efficiency cost does depend on which goods you sabotage. If we increase the location of the sabotaged goods, that means if we shock the goods that had a low comparative advantage to start with, for those goods, distortion in production is more costly because we're moving to a more productive location to a less productive location. And therefore, efficiency cost is higher if we move to the rightmost products. Then that is a formula that we can take to data. But as we said, before doing that, we want to add back more realistic features. And that means we want to bring back trade costs so that we need to keep track of more stuff, including home country's size relative to the global economy. And then we also introduce incomplete specialization by saying that home and foreign varieties of the same good are differentiated, and there is elasticity of substitution between them that we need to keep track of, product by product. But the intuition stays the same, which is that the benefit of sabotage is only local to the marginal good, whereas the efficiency cost changes with which goods you sabotage. And then our next result is comparing the effect of sabotage to the effect of technology transfer. And we're able to show that for goods that are close enough to the cutoff goods, the sabotage is always better than some level of technology transfer. And then for goods that have the highest efficiency cost, it's going to imply that sabotage is going to lower home country's welfare because it's too distortionary to change. And for the middle range of product, sabotage is better than doing nothing, but it's worse than technology transfer. One takeaway here is that theoretically there always exists products for which sabotage is beneficial to home country. So our next question is, okay, now we know sabotage is useful, but do we know that it is still useful if the home planner has access to other policy tools? And we show that when home planner has access to only tariffs, it's always beneficial to have sabotage on top of that. And the argument is, we know that the optimal tariff in this classic world is going to be uniform, and then we're able to show that given this initial uniform tariff, sabotage increases home country's welfare for some products. And then what happens when home country has access to unrestricted policy tools? Is sabotage still a useful policy to have? And the answer is yes, for some times. There are conditions for that to be true. And we know that with unrestricted trade instruments, the optimal policy is to have zero tariff, but some level of export taxes that makes foreign country indifferent between importing versus producing domestically. And then we're able to show that in that scenario, if some condition is met, then sabotage is still useful. And that condition depends on the shape of the comparative advantage around the cut-off goods. So if it's pretty flat, that means to absorb the sabotaged goods, home country only needs to give up very few marginal products to foreign country. So the benefit is larger. Okay. One last theoretical result we're considering here is, okay, sabotage is good, but how to implement that? One way to implement that is through export control. So we extend our model to a case where we allow for export control. And we change production technology to be consisting of a fraction of labor input, but also a critical material M. So this could be rare earth or some critical material without which downstream production is impossible. And we showed that so home country is the owner of these critical materials. And we showed that if home country bans the export of these critical materials, there's going to be the following change in welfare. First of all, there is the standard sabotage effect, because without this critical material, foreign countries' productivity goes to zero. So that's effective sabotage. What's more interesting is that there is cost of doing export control, because home country would lose export revenue from these materials. And what is the best product to impose export control on? It's going to be the product for which labor share is high and material share is low. It's something like rare earth, because without that, downstream production is impossible, but export revenue is low to start with for these type of products. So distortion is lower. All right, then we wrap up this paper with two empirical exercises. In the first exercise, we compare the benefit and cost of doing sabotage across different industries. And in the second exercise, we fix the industry to be semiconductor only, but we vary the intensity of sabotage. I'm going to skip how we calibrated the parameters for the model, but just show you the results. Okay. The first result, as you can see, the terms of trade gain or the benefit of sabotage is pretty similar across different industries. However, if you look at the cost of imposing sabotage, it differs quite a lot, because different industries have very different elasticity of substitution between home and foreign varieties, and the revealed relative cost is also quite different across industries. However, if you only look at the net effect of sabotage, it's positive for almost all industries. Okay, the second exercise is to show you how sabotage in semiconductor affects home country's welfare. Delta is the intensity of sabotage, and a negative value corresponds to technology transfer. On the y-axis, we're plotting the percentage change in home country's welfare, and you can see the result says that when delta is negative, when home country does a technology transfer, it's going to help home country's welfare, but when home country conducts a modest sabotage, it's going to lower welfare. But if we increase the intensity to make sabotage comprehensive, then it becomes positive effect again. So if you can remember only one message from this paper, we hope the thing that we can convey to you is that having a partially effective sabotage program is worse than having no program at all. With that, I'll stop.
Yeah, you can just leave. Okay, then I hand over to Claudia Gentile, who's discussing the paper.
Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me to discuss this paper. My name is Claudia Gentile, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Geneva. And I've been very glad to have the opportunity to read this paper. I think this is a very interesting paper and highly policy relevant. I think what made me most interested about this paper is that this should, I think it's very important to think about this new policy instrument like sabotage, both from a theoretical and also an empirical point of view, with respect to instead more traditional policy instruments like trade policy, like tariffs policies. And this is a highly policy relevant paper. As we have seen in the last year, there has been many examples of sabotage. That is, many examples of countries trying to affect negatively the productivity of other countries. So for example, the US, we have seen, has tried to impose many export restrictions and export controls on crucial inputs in the semiconductor industry towards China, with the aim of slowing down the ability of China to produce very advanced chips, especially chips that can be used for artificial intelligence, in the military, and in the surveillance sectors. And China has then retaliated to these measures by imposing export controls, for instance, on rare earth metals, also with the aim of decreasing the productivity of other countries. What I think is a very interesting question that this paper addresses is how can we reconcile the interests of policymakers in sabotaging other countries' productivity with instead a more general message from the trade literature, which is the idea that if a country is already importing a good from a foreign country, then actually making a technology transfer towards the other country is going to be welfare enhancing for the domestic country, as this is going to reduce the price of the imported goods, and this is going to have a positive impact on welfare. So how can we reconcile these two opposite policies? Are policymakers wrong, and these sabotaging policies are actually going to decrease welfare? Or is it possible that transferring technology to a foreign country has the same positive impact as sabotaging, which would be the very complete opposite policy? And this paper finds a very interesting and somewhat maybe also surprising result, if we think about this question, that comprehensive sabotage can have a positive impact on welfare of the domestic country, but only under certain conditions. In particular, this is going to be true only if sabotage is focused on goods where the foreign country has a low comparative advantage. So first, I would like to review what is the key mechanism at play, but by focusing on one of the simple equations that come out also at the beginning of the paper. That is, what are the key terms that are affecting utility in the domestic countries. So we are in a Dornbus, Fisher, and Samuelson world where there is a continuum of varieties, and the varieties are going to be ordered by the relative comparative advantage between the world, the home, and the foreign countries. So for high varieties, the foreign country has a comparative advantage. So in the home country, these goods will be imported from the foreign country. We can define I bar as the cutoff value, where the unit cost is going to be equivalent between the foreign and the domestic country. And we can see that the utility in this word can be defined and described as a simple function of the differences in comparative advantage between the two countries and of the cutoff value where the two countries are going to have the same unit cost. So in this case, the utility is a function of two terms. The first term, which is a function of wages at home and in the foreign country, which describes the terms of trade. So if the price of exports are higher than the price of imports, this is going to be good for the domestic country in terms of trade. And the second term instead defines what are the gains for the domestic country of importing goods where the foreign country has higher productivity. So these terms here, the log difference between the productivity of the foreign and the domestic country is going to typically be negative because the domestic country will always import goods where the foreign country has a comparative advantage. So thinking that utility depends on terms of trade and efficiency differences between the domestic and the foreign country, we can ask what is the impact of sabotage. So in this case, sabotage, and in particular I'm going to focus on comprehensive sabotage, which is the case where that has a positive welfare impact on domestic countries. If there is a comprehensive sabotage of a specific variety I that is produced initially in the foreign country, then this the production of this good is going to be restored at home. So at home, there is going to be more demand for labor, which is going to increase wages and results in an improvement in the terms of trade. On the other side, there is also going to be an efficiency cost because the good that was produced in the foreign country now is produced at home, and home has a lower productivity in this sector. So whether the sabotage is going to have a positive or negative impact on welfare is going to depend on whether the impact on the terms of trade is going to be stronger than the impact on the efficiency, negative impact due to the increase in efficiency cost. And this is going to be positive only if the good that now is restored at home is a good where the foreign country has a relatively low comparative advantage. In order to then also have a quantitative application of this model and this idea, then the authors also add other important elements to the model, in particular intra-sectoral trade. So I think overall this paper brings about a very interesting theoretical contribution to the literature by showing that comprehensive sabotage can have the same impact as an improvement in technology of the foreign country, so the same impact as technology transfer. I think I would like to make, in particular, some comments on the quantitative application, as I think this is the part of the paper where there can be more work that can be done, maybe in this project or maybe in future projects. So for instance, I was trying to think about how comes that comprehensive sabotage is all welfare enhancing in all sectors. Might we be underestimating what are the efficiency costs or overestimating the terms of trade gains? So for instance, I think something that would be interesting to take into account is whether we might be underestimating efficiency losses because we are not taking into account supply chain linkages. So in this context, we have a fixed expenditure share across sectors, and there are no input-output linkages across the different sectors. So if we think of sabotaging a very upstream good, like could be, for instance, semiconductors, in this setting, is going to have an effect of the prices of semiconductor and therefore increase the efficiency cost due to more expensive semiconductors, but it's not going to have a strong effect on prices of other goods. While if we think that semiconductors are a very upstream sector, this, for instance, they are used in electronics, in the automotive sector, in information and communication technologies. So an impact on the prices of this good can have also an important efficiency cost in other sectors of the economy. So I think if one were to expand more on the supply chain linkages, I wonder if we would get higher efficiency costs. Secondly, I think it would be interesting to think about how the results would change if we move behind the idea of having two regions. So in this case, there are two regions, the US and the rest of the world. I think in this way, we might end up a bit overestimating what are the gains from improvements in terms of trade, because when the foreign good is sabotaged, then all the demand goes back to the US. In this case, both demand, what is the domestic demand from the US, the demand from but also all the demand from the rest of the world now will buy this good from the US. Instead, I'm thinking that often these policies are targeted towards a specific country. So it would be interesting to see how the results would change if we had instead 3, 4 regions and only one region that is going to be targeted by the policy. So maybe I would conclude with a last comment, which I think is more maybe a comment also for future work and what I think are some interesting questions that this work opens up for future research, which are also what are the distributional effects of these policies. Because here we are considering terms of trade and efficiency costs for the whole economy. But if we think about it more carefully, depending on the sector to which the sabotage policy is going to be applied, this could have different distributional effects. So for instance, if we think about if the semiconductor sector is a sector with a high demand for high-skilled labor, then the terms of trade, increase in terms of trade is going to be particularly positive for the high-skilled workers because there will be more demand for high-skilled workers, while the efficiency costs, given that semiconductors are a very upstream good, are going to be felt across different sectors of the economy, and the price increases might affect both the high-skilled and the low-skilled workers. So I think it would be very interesting to also think about what are the distributional effects of these policies. I very much enjoyed reading the paper, and I'm looking forward to see the next iterations or future work in this area.
Thank you. Okay, you want to directly respond, and then we have time. We have 5 minutes or so. We can go a bit in the break, but so you have time to go downstairs. Yeah.
All right, let me just briefly respond to some of the questions. But Claudia, that's a great discussion. Thank you so much. So the first point, an easy one, which is like in the table we showed you, the net effect is positive for almost all of the industries. Actually, there are very few industries that we didn't include in the table that has negative net effect of sabotage. But you're right, it depends on the trade elasticity that we put in, etc. So varies with parameter values. An interesting point definitely is how do we think about sabotage in the world with input-output linkage. And our exercise on the critical material has some sense of that by saying there is like an upstream material which is critical to the downstream production, but it's very ad hoc in that sense. There is only one layer of input-output linkage. It's definitely a brand new agenda to think about how to model this in a more generalized production network. I think what matters is going to be the centrality of the product that you target matters, how upstream it is going to matter, etc. So one important thing is about the third country. So our model talks about US versus China, but actually the world is much larger than this. How do we think about that? So you're right that if there is third-party countries, what we're estimating is the lower bound of the benefit of sabotage. Because when the US forces production to leave China, but the production does not go back to the US, instead it goes to some third-party countries, it means US gets the efficiency lost by making imports more expensive, but it doesn't get any of the benefit because it doesn't have terms of trading increase, it doesn't have higher income. In that sense, you're right, what we're getting is the lower bound estimate, and the implication of that is a partially effective sabotage program is even less likely to be useful. A last point I want to say is that definitely it's interesting to think about distributional effect of sabotage. Our model is not able to do that because we have only input as the homogeneous production factor. But if you have heterogeneous workers like skilled versus unskilled, or if you have labor and capital as two production inputs, then it's interesting to look at whether sabotage benefits one particular production factor versus others. Totally, that's very interesting topics for the future.
Okay, in the interest of time, we would have time for 1, 2 very short questions.
Thank you, Ann Harrison, Berkeley and CEPR. I wonder if what the effect would be if there was a large country that would respond with its own either sabotage or, I mean, my sense in the case of China is that it's going to go full steam in producing the goods that are being sabotaged. What would be the impact if there was a response?
Yeah, totally. So in this paper, we're taking the other countries' action as given. They're not responding at all. That's why the home country may have some net benefit of doing sabotage. Instead, if foreign country is going to retaliate in a similar manner, then what's going to imply is that this is like a zero-sum game where we are driven down to the worst possible scenario, and totally it's going to have different implications, and sabotage is definitely going to be worse in that world. But it's interesting topic for strategic games between countries in terms of sabotage policy.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have a 10-minute break, and at 3 we have a policy panel downstairs. Thank you.